Hey friends, welcome back to the read aloud of Mrs. Pigglewiggle, read aloud number 3. We just met Hubert on our last reading, and Hubert has lots and lots of very nice toys, but he never picks them up, which is just not respectful of his things. And he just had all of his friends over, and they were playing with all the toys, and they didn't put any of them away. And his mother is just getting exasperated. Let's see. Perspiration broke out on Hubert's mother's forehead, and she began to feel faint. So she closed the door and slowly went downstairs after seeing that he and his friends had left out all of his toys from their play date. She took 2 aspirin tablets and then telephoned her friend, Mrs. Baggs. She said, "Hello, Mrs. Baggs. This is Hubert's mother, and I am so disappointed in Hubert. He has such lovely toys. His grandfather sends them to him every Christmas, you know, but he does not take care of them at all. He just leaves them all over his room for me to pick up every morning." Mrs. Baggs said, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Prentice, but I can't help you because, you see, I think it's too late." "Why, it's only 9:30, said Hubert's mother. "Oh, I mean late in life," said Mrs. Baggs. "You see, we started Erminitrud picking up her toys when she was 6 months old. A place for everything and everything in its place. We have always told Erminitrud. Now she is so neat that she becomes hysterical if she sees a crumb on the floor." "Well, I certainly hope she never sees Hubert's room," said Mrs. Prentice dryly. "She'd probably have a fit." And she hung up the phone. Then she called Mrs. Moohead. "Good morning, Mrs. Moohead," she said. "Does Gregory pick up his toys?" "Well, no, he doesn't," said Mrs. Moohead. "But you know, Gregory is rather delicate, and I feel that just playing with his toys tires him so much that I personally see that all of his little friends put the toys away before they go home." So Gregory's friends put his toys away that they play with, that's good. "That is a splendid idea," said Hubert's mother, "but I am trying to train Hubert, not his playmates." "Well, of course, Hubert is very strong and healthy, but Gregory is intelligent," said Mrs. Moohead. "Is he?" said Mrs. Prentice crossly, because she resented this inference that her son was all brawn and no brain. "Oh dear," squealed Mrs. Moohead. "I think Gregory is running a temperature. I must go to him." She hung up the phone. Mrs. Prentice then called Mrs. Grapple. "Hello, Marge," she said. "How is Susan?" Mrs. Grapple said, "I've spanked her 7 times since breakfast, and I just heard a crash, so she is probably getting ready for another. How's Hubert?" "That's what I called about," said Mrs. Prentice. "Can you suggest a way to make Hubert want to pick up his toys? His room looks like a toy store after an earthquake." "Why don't you call Mrs. Pigglewiggle? I have heard she is perfectly wonderful. All the children in town adore her, and she is a cure for everything. As soon as I spank Susan, I'm going to call her." Hubert's mother said, "Thank you very much, Marge. That's just what I'll do. I had forgotten about Mrs. Pigglewiggle, but I just know she can help me." So she called Mrs. Pigglewiggle and said, "I hate to bother you, but you seem always to know what to do about children, and I'll confess that I don't know what to do to make Hubert put his toys away." Mrs. Pigglewiggle said, "Hubert is the sweet little boy with all the wonderful toys that his grandfather sends him, isn't he?" Mrs. Prentice said, "Why, yes, but I didn't know that you knew him." "Oh, yes," said Mrs. Pigglewiggle. "Hubert and I are old friends. In fact, he is building an automobile in my backyard out of orange crates and empty tomato cans. Hubert is a very good carpenter." Hubert's mother thought of the 2 little automobiles with rubber tires, real horns, leather seats, big enough for 2 boys, and lights that had turned on with a switch that Hubert's grandfather had given him, and she wondered why in the world he would want to build an automobile out of old orange crates and tomato cans. She said, however, "So that is where he and Dickie go every afternoon? I certainly hope he behaves himself." "Oh, he does," said Mrs. Pigglewiggle. "We are all very fond of Hubert. But this problem of his toys, let me see. Mrs. Pigglewiggle was quiet for some time. Then she said, I think that the best thing for you to use is my old-fashioned won't pick up toys cure. Starting now, don't pick up any of Hubert's toys. Don't make his bed. In fact, do not go into his room. When his room becomes so messy he can't get out of it, call me. Mrs. Pigglewiggle said goodbye and hung up the phone. All right, so Mrs. Pigglewiggle's directions were, when his room becomes so messy and he can't get out of it, call me. Hubert's mother, looking very relieved, went gaily about her housework, baked a chocolate cake for dinner, and did not say a word to Hubert when he came home with 10 little boys, and they all trailed upstairs to play in Hubert's room. The next morning when Hubert came downstairs for breakfast, his mother noticed that he had a little pan of watercolor paint stuck in his hair, and his shirt had purple ink from the printing set on one shoulder. She said nothing but tripped upstairs after breakfast and quietly shut the door of his room. The next morning, Hubert's mother had a little trouble shutting the door of his room, and she noticed that Hubert had circles under his eyes, as though he had not slept very well. The next morning, Hubert was very late coming downstairs, and before he opened his door, his mother heard a great clatter and scraping as though he were moving furniture. He had little builder bolts stuck to his sweater and 2 paint pans in his hair. He was so sleepy he could barely keep his eyes open, and he had a red mark on one cheek. His mother looked at it closely and saw that it was the shape and size of one of his stone blocks. He must have slept with his head on one of the bridges. On the 7th day, after Hubert's mother stopped putting away his toys, he did not come down to breakfast at all. About 11 o'clock, his mother became worried and called up Mrs. Pigglewiggle. She said, "Good morning, Mrs. Pigglewiggle. This is the 7th day of the old-fashioned won't pick up toys cure, and I am worried. Hubert has not come downstairs at all this morning." Mrs. Pigglewiggle said, "Well, let me see. The 7th day. It usually takes 10 days, but Hubert has so many toys, he would naturally be quicker." "Quicker at what?" asked Hubert's mother anxiously. "Quicker at getting trapped in his room," said Mrs. Pigglewiggle. "You see, the reason Hubert hasn't come downstairs is that he cannot get out of his room. Have you noticed anything different about him lately?" "Well," said Hubert's mother, "he looks as though he hasn't been sleeping well, and on the 4th morning he had a red blotch on his cheek, just the shape of one of his stone blocks." Said Mrs. Pigglewiggle. "He probably can't get at his bed and is sleeping with his head on his blocks for a pillow." "But what will I do?" asked Hubert's mother. "How will I feed him?" "Wait until he calls for food, then tell him to open the window and you can put a piece of rather dry bread and peanut butter on the garden rake. He will have to drink out of the hose. Tie it to the rake and poke it up to him." When Hubert's mother hung up the telephone, she heard a muffled shouting from the direction of Hubert's room. She hurried upstairs and listened outside the door. Hubert was shouting, "Mother, I'm hungry," because it was almost lunchtime. Mother said, "Go over and open the window, dear, and I will send something up to you on the rake." Mrs. Prentice took the crusty piece of a very old loaf of bread, spread some peanut butter on it, and took it around to the side of the house. Pretty soon Hubert's window was raised about a foot, and a hand and arm appeared. His mother stuck the bread on one of the tines of the rake and poked it up at the window. The hand groped around for a while and then found the piece of bread and jerked it off. The window banged shut. Here's a picture. Looks like Hubert's mother and father giving him some water from the garden hose and setting up some food on a rake. That night when Hubert's father came home, his mother told him all about Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle's treatment. Hubert's father said, "Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle sounds all right, but none of this would have happened if Hubert's grandfather hadn't given him so many toys. When I was a boy, all I needed to have a good time was a little piece of string and a stick. Mrs. Prentice said, "Not that old string and stick routine again, John. Anyway, now that Hubert has the toys, the picture is changed." Mr. Prentice hid his face behind the evening paper and said, "Something smells delicious. Is it Irish stew, I hope?" "Yes, dear," said Hubert's mother, worrying about how she was going to serve Irish stew to Hubert on a rake. She finally put a potato on one prong, a carrot on another, an onion on another, and pieces of meat on the last three. The window was opened only about 3 inches, but the hand grabbed the food. After dinner, Hubert's father tied the hose to the rake and held it up while Hubert put his mouth to the window opening and tried to get a drink of water. It was not very successful, but he managed to get a few drops. Mrs. Prentice was worried. The next morning, she knocked on Hubert's door and said, "Hubert, what are you doing in there?" Hubert said, "I've got a bear pen made out of bureau drawers, and my bed's the mother bear's house, and my train runs under my bed 13 times now." "Hubert, dear, don't you think you should try and come out soon?" asked his mother. Hubert said, "I don't want to come out. I like it in here. All my toys are out, and I can play with them any old time I wanna. This is fun." His mother went downstairs and called Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, "Oh, but he will want to come out. Wait and see." That afternoon, about 2 o'clock, there was music on the street and children's voices laughing and calling, and pretty soon, right past Hubert's house, marched Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle and all the children, and right behind them came the circus parade. Hubert managed, by putting one foot in the bureau drawer and the other foot in a freight car of his train, to get up to the window and look out. He waved to Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, and she called, "Hurry, hurry, Hubert. We are all going to march all over town, and then we are all going to the circus." All right, I think that's a good place to stop for today. For reading number 3. Thanks for joining me. See you next time.